Okay, so this is the second part of the lecture for the body image module on the ancient modern body or the modern ancient body. Part one, not happy with the quality of it, but I talked for over an hour, so I'm not inclined to do it again. I'm sorry. That's available on YouTube. But in the first video, we just to recap, we covered the idea of different paradigms of the body, different medical paradigms, different paradigms of treatment. Remember the supposed east-west distinction and binary. We looked at that in quite broad brushstrokes, and I discussed the kind of obscure, maybe occult origins of both Western and Eastern approaches to the to understanding the body and to understanding bodily health, different medical paradigms and contemporary modern hybrids, which is why I've put Eastern in inverted commas there. Eastern hybrids. So that this is really the segue into the entire concept of the New Age, not just New Age religion, New Age spirituality, New Age cosmologies around the human body, about which there's lots in the history of New Age interests and New Age theories is quite long and quite complex. So this is all very introductory. But if you Google these things, I mean, if you just do a tiny bit of research around them, you'll find lots of material on them. And then a digression into the Umberto Eco section in his book Foucault's Pendulum, on which was on magic numbers and the human body and the reasons why certain numbers have sort of religious or spiritual or magic implications. Sorry, I'm just taking a sneaky drink of tea. I thought I'd get away with that, but not for the sound effect. And then we recapped. I did some revision on the idea of the invention of tradition and the invention of embodied bodily traditions, looking at recalling the work of Hobsbawm and Ranger, and the way in which things that we often believe to be ancient are often very contemporary. And then we looked at Slavoj Žižek's argument, which he gets also from Peter Sloterdijk and probably gets a bit from Alain Badiou as well. Žižek rips most of his ideas off from Badiou. His argument that Western Buddhism, Western Taoism is the contemporary is the ideal ideology for of contemporary capitalism. It's quite interesting because I did some different research into newspaper stories around martial arts, and when Žižek was coming up with this argument, this book was published in about 2000, 2001. If you look at the British and Western context, there were lots of stories that read then around about Tai Chi and about Feng Shui and about yoga and Buddhism and Taoism. And I think that maybe Žižek has a point that at a certain point in time in the late 20th and early 21st century, that kind of Taoist, Buddhist, sort of pseudo-Taoist, pseudo-Buddhist philosophies were indeed dominant in the ascendant. So there's a lot to be thought about that there as well. And then a section on body types, stereotypes about the association of certain physical practices, ostensibly ancient physical practice with certain types of ethnicity and certain types of body type, the classifications, which kind of people we expect to be involved in which kind of activities. And then we concluded the lecture looking at yoga, its kind of paradoxical history as both ancient and yet a very modern invention, which is why I put ancient in inverted commas here, because yes, the word yoga is ancient, but actually it's at most a kind of late 19th and really it's a 20th century invented tradition. So this is the very thing. It's the kind of thing that Hobsbawm and Ranger called an invented tradition, because it appeals to an ancient past, but it's actually, very active and very creative and being devised in the present. Now, this kind of thing happens a lot, and that's what I want to talk about in the remainder of this lecture. We concluded the last bit by thinking about the notion of sport and the paradigm of healthism. The Western paradigm of healthism, as Ben Spatz has pointed out, is, and it's not just Ben Spatz, but that's the text that we have set for this week's reading. So I'm talking about Ben Spatz here. The notion of healthism is one that conflates a kind of mesomorphism, a kind of athletic, muscular, striated, Olympic kind of athlete-looking thing as exemplifying health, is a comparatively recent and local version of what health is. And the Spatz's argument is that, not only Spatz's argument, but the argument that he puts forward is that we often get confused in the West between performativity, and health. So the athletes who are superlative athletes in the world are not necessarily the most healthy, not at all. And that's even before you start to factor in discussions around drugs and supplements, prostheses, and dangerous practices. So that's where we left it. And I want to pick up on the interest of tea. I love tea. You didn't need to know that. I want to pick up on the question of why some bodily practices sort of need to be ancient. What's all that about? Why do we want certain of our activities to have a really long cultural heritage or really long cultural legacy? And I'll just give a couple of examples. So a famous example would be wrestling. So when you look at the work of Joseph Alter and his studies of wrestling, he connects it with nationalism. He connects, and more than he does, lots of scholars, lots of historians have noted that the emergence of nationalism through the 19th century, the real production and invention of nations, and some nations are still very much in processes of invention themselves. It requires images of the superlative national subject, the stuffed and the strong and fit and healthy, athletic, militaristic, powerful national subject. So nations, post-colonial nations such as India, have constructed the idea of the Indian wrestler and appeal to really ancient traditions. And then you've got cases like cases that I've looked at before and that interest me around the invention of a nation through a sport or martial art, such as Taekwondo. So in South Korea and North Korea, all of the Koreas, they have had a really problematic and conflicted and colonized past. So Japan invaded and colonized Korea, and basically wiped out a lot of indigenous traditions. This is a problem of all kinds of colonialism: British colonialism, European colonialism. The ancient the indigenous traditions are either regulated or kind of neutered in different ways, or just squashed out and replaced with the new value traditions, the traditions that are given the highest cultural status, which would be those of the colonizer. So after the Second World War, when Japan left, were forced to leave Korea, it, as a nation, as in terms of national identity, that it had a crisis of identity and had to kind of had to reconstruct its image. And one of the things that it did was it reconstructed the idea of an ancient martial heritage, and it did so by claiming that, in the first instance, that Taekwondo was an ancient martial art based on an even more ancient indigenous tradition called Tekyon. And the problem with it is there are two problems. One is that Taekwondo was devised in about 1952. The name was settled on in about 1955, and Taekwondo is essentially based on Japanese martial arts because that's what all the people in the Korean military had been taught. But the one country that they didn't want to have anything to do with was Japan. So they had to try and obscure. Well, they didn't have to, but what they did was they obscured the connection with the colonizing power by invoking and evoking a more ancient indigenous tradition. And this was the idea of an art called Tekyon, which was a kicking game or a kicking ritual or a kind of martial game or something. But this leads us to the second problem, because historians have noted that there's really no evidence of the unbroken survival of the tradition of Tekyon into the 20th century at all. So Taekwondo was invented from a myth of an indigenous art or an indigenous practice in order to kind of rewrite the history of the modern practice by invoking a much older historical practice. And if you look at some of these images, these are old Korean artwork, statues, and images, and so on. What they even went so far as to kind of include some of these sorts of postures in recently invented, modern, contemporary, relatively contemporary, late 20th century Taekwondo kata patterns, forms, and then claimed that the reason why these postures were in the forms is because they always have been there, but they weren't. They were invented on the inspiration of these old statues and old carvings and engravings. So, what's the status of this? Well, if you Hobsbawm and Ranger talk about the political importance of invented traditions, Edward Said also talks about these things. Lots of people do. Jacques Derrida talks about the notion of, he calls it teleopoiesis. There's a good word for Scrabble. So teleopoiesis. So poiesis meaning to do with invention, creation, composition, and teleo to do with like time, yeah, and space, across time and space, into the future and into the past. And so you're inventing on the basis of time. So you invent your national identity in your cultural practices by appealing to ancient lineage. So some practices in some contexts for different reasons, like nationalism, nation building, identity construction, really rely on the idea of an ancient and venerable lineage and legacy in order to construct a sense of identity. And then you get smart ass academics come along like me who go, yeah, but you just made that up, right? And that's called myth busting. Academics are involved in myth busting, and it can be, quite regarded as quite aggressive, right? It can be quite or disrespectful. But I think it's, on the one hand, yeah, it is, but it's also important to disrespect things that aren't actually true, because I think that, if you're involved in the invention of a national identity, there are ways to do it that don't involve just telling lies about the past. Okay. This gets even more complicated because when I went to South Korea and I went to a Tekyon class, and I thought it was absolutely amazing, and the Taekwondo was amazing, and I kind of came away like believing that that it was part of an ancient tradition, even though I went in there fully believing that it wasn't. But that's a different discussion. So in the case of yoga, so Mark Singleton in his book, and Ben Spatz in the chapter that I asked you to read, talks about the way in which the construction of yoga is a similar kind of process. It's so the truth of the matter is, according to Ben Spatz, that it should be regarded as a research program. Like, let's work out ways of stretching and exercising and exploring the body's capacities, finding out what a body can do. So it's like scholarly research. It's like embodied research. We when we do yoga, we could just be exploring. We're researching our own